In the vast, unforgiving deserts of North Africa, a battle-ragedon that would become the stuff of legend. Erwin Rommel, the man known to his enemies as the Desert Fox, was surrounded. His forces, trapped by the might of the Allied armies, faced certain defeat. Or so it seemed. But what if I told you that despite being encircled on all sides, Rommel not only survived, but triumphed? This is the story of a man who defied the odds, outsmarted his enemies, and changed the course of history. A story of a general whose name still echoes through the corridors of military strategy and whose actions remain the subject of awe. Erwin Rommel, a commander with the heart of a lion, a tactician like no other, and a man who would not give up no matter the odds. On one fateful day, surrounded by overwhelming force, Rommel had no choice but to make a decision that would either end in defeat or cement his place in history forever. Stay with me as we uncover the incredible story of how Erwin Rommel was surrounded, but still won. Before Erwin Rommel became the Desert Fox, before his name was etched in the annals of military legend, he was just a young man from a modest background, destined for greatness. Born in 1891 in the small town of Heidenheim, Germany, Rommel's journey began not on the battlefield, but with a deep love for adventure and a desire to serve his country. Rommel's early life was far from glamorous. His family was not wealthy, and his father, a teacher, was strict, demanding excellence from his children. Rommel, however, had a different path in mind. While others in his family pursued academic careers, Erwin was drawn to the military. The discipline and structure of the army called to him, and at the age of 18, he entered the German Imperial Army as a cadet. It was here that Rommel would begin to form his identity as a soldier, sharp, calculated, and determined. His early years in the army were marked by quiet discipline, but his real rise to prominence came during World War I. Serving on the Western Front, Rommel proved himself time and again, earning the respect of his fellow soldiers and the admiration of his superiors. In one of his first major battles, the young officer distinguished himself through an audacious and highly successful raid that surprised the enemy. This was the moment when Rommel's tactical brilliance began to shine. His ability to think outside the box and inspire those around him quickly set him apart from others. Rommel's daring tactics were not without risk. He pushed his men to the edge, leading from the front, refusing to stay behind lines of safety. And it was this boldness that earned him the respect of his soldiers. He wasn't just a commander, he was their leader, the one who fought beside them, and they would follow him anywhere. By the end of World War I, Rommel had earned the prestigious Pour le Mérite, one of Germany's highest military honors. His reputation as a fierce, fearless leader was now firmly established. But little did Rommel know, his most famous battle sand, the ultimate test of his skill, were still many years away. His next chapter would take him far from the trenches of Europe to the scorching deserts of North Africa, where the world would come to know the man who could win, even when surrounded. The stage for Rommel's greatest challenge was set not in the fields of Europe, but in the barren, unforgiving deserts of North Africa. It was 1941, and the Allies were locked in a brutal struggle against Axis forces for control of the Mediterranean. The North African campaign had already seen its share of skirmishes, but now a new player was about to enter the fray. Erwin Rommel, a name that would soon send shockwaves through the British command, was called upon by Adolf Hitler to lead the Afrika Korps. His mission: to assist the Italian forces who had been struggling to hold their ground against the Allied powers. But what the Allies didn't know was that Rommel wasn't just another commander. He was a man who saw the battlefield differently, who saw opportunity where others saw defeat. Rommel's first steps in North Africa were marked by an almost immediate assault. He quickly proved his mettle, pushing the British forces back with an aggressive strategy that defied traditional expectations. His use of surprise, speed, and audacity became his trademark. He didn't play by the rules. He wasn't just fighting to hold ground. Rommel was fighting to win, and win quickly. His forces moved like lightning through the desert, taking advantage of the terrain, striking when and where his enemies least expected it. His enemies were caught off guard, bewildered by his unconventional tactics and bold moves. Rommel's success in the desert wasn't just about the battles he won, but about the way he inspired his troops. The men who fought under him were not just soldiers. They were followers, driven by his leadership, by his willingness to take risks right alongside them. His rise in North Africa was unstoppable. The British, under General Wavell, found themselves pushed back, outmaneuvered, and often defeated by a man they had underestimated. Rommel's name began to spread. He was more than just a German general, was a force of nature, a master of desert warfare, and one of the most feared commanders in the world. But as Rommel's victories mounted, so did the stakes. The Allies were not going to sit back and let him continue his streak of success. Soon they would regroup, and the battle for North Africa would escalate to a level no one could have anticipated. As Rommel's victories in North Africa continued, the Allies knew they had to stop him. His rapid advances had shaken the very foundations of the British Empire's presence in the region. The stakes had never been higher, and the next battle would become one of the most crucial of the entire campaign. El Alamein, Egypt. A small town that would soon be written into history as the site of one of the most intense clashes of World War II. It was October 1942, and Rommel's forces had pushed deep into Egypt, threatening to capture the Suez Canal, a vital lifeline for the Allies. The British could not afford to lose this strategic location. The Axis powers, under Rommel's leadership, were now within striking distance of a decisive victory. But this time, Rommel was facing a new kind of enemy that had learned from its past mistakes. The British had regrouped, strengthened their defences, and were now under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, a man determined to halt Rommel's advance. Rommel, stretched thin by months of continuous fighting, was facing supply shortages and exhausted troops. The desert, once his ally, had become his adversary. The heat, the sandstorms, and the constant threat of Allied air superiority weighed heavily on him. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Rommel remained resolute. The Battle of El Alamein would be a test of everything Rommel stood for: his ability to outmaneuver, outthink, and outlast his opponents. As the battle unfolded, it became clear that this would not be a quick victory. The Allies had dug in, and Rommel's bold tactics were met with stiff resistance. In the brutal desert terrain, Rommel's Afrika Korps faced fierce counterattacks. The British forces were well prepared, their defences formidable. The battle turned into a war of attrition, with neither side willing to give up an inch. Rommel pushed forward with everything he had, using his trademark speed and cunning, but Montgomery was no novice. The battle raged for days, and Rommel soon realized that victory would not come as easily as it had before. The balance of power was shifting. The Battle of El Alamein marked the first significant defeat for Rommel in North Africa. The British had successfully halted his advance, forcing the Afrika Korps into a retreat. It was a devastating blow, not just to Rommel's forces, but to his confidence. The Desert Fox had been bested, but the war was far from over. Despite the crushing defeat at El Alamein, Rommel's resilience was like no other. The Desert Fox had been momentarily halted, but the war was far from over. While his forces were forced to retreat, his spirit remained unbroken. Rommel understood that battles were won with more than just soldiers, and weapons they were won with willpower, boldness, and the ability to adapt. The next chapter in Rommel's North African campaign would come in the form of Tobruk, a strategically important port city in Libya. Tobruk was more than just a city. It was a fortress, a symbol of resistance. The British had turned it into one of the most heavily fortified locations in all of North Africa. Its capture would not only give Rommel access to crucial supplies and a stronger position for future operations, but it would also deal a crushing blow to the Allies' ability to hold the region. Rommel knew that capturing Tobruk would be no simple task. The British garrison there, under General Sir Neil Ritchie, was well entrenched, with miles of defensive positions and a powerful network of artillery. For months, the British had managed to hold the city, but Rommel was not a man to be deterred by such obstacles. In the wake of his defeat at El Alamein, Rommel had a singular goal: to demonstrate that he still had the ability to outmaneuver the Allies, to show that despite setbacks, his leadership and tactical brilliance could turn the tide once more.
Rommel's plan for Tobruk was aggressive, and it relied on his signature approach to warfare: speed, surprise, and audacity. He moved his forces swiftly, executing a series of lightning-fast strikes aimed at testing the British defences. Rommel did not believe in waiting for the perfect moment. He created that moment with each bold action. His men, though exhausted and worn from previous campaigns, followed him with unshakable loyalty. They knew that under Rommel's leadership, they would be given every opportunity to succeed. In battle, Rommel was always at the front, sharing the same risks and dangers as his men. His leadership style wasn't just about commanding from behind the line sit, was about leading by example, being there when it mattered most. Rommel's forces pushed forward with brutal precision. His troops would strike under the cover of night, launching attacks at key positions in British lines, often in places where they were least expected. These tactical strikes kept the British forces off balance, forcing them to constantly reassess their defences. But the battle for Tobruk was not won easily. The Allies had prepared for this moment. Tobruk was no ordinary fortress. It was a well-stocked and well-defended stronghold, with deep trenches, anti-tank barriers, and heavy artillery positioned at critical points. The British were prepared to fight for every inch of ground. As the siege stretched on, Rommel faced more than just physical challenges. His forces were stretched thin, their supply lines increasingly disrupted, and the punishing desert heat was taking its toll. But Rommel was not one to give up. He understood that his men's morale was as important as any weapon in his arsenal. He spent hours on the front lines, encouraging his soldiers, directing fire, and often taking the same risks they did. The siege lasted for weeks, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Rommel's forces, slowly but surely, tightened their grip on the city, using their superior mobility to outflank and overwhelm the British defences. The Axis forces had no heavy artillery like the British, but Rommel's cunning use of mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare wore the enemy down. Finally, after weeks of intense fighting, Rommel's forces succeeded. The British, unable to break the siege, were forced to retreat. Tobruk fell into German hands. For Rommel, it was a monumental victory, one that proved his resilience and his ability to recover from defeat. The city's capture was not just a strategic win, but a psychological one. Rommel's forces now controlled one of the most important locations in North Africa, but the victory came at a cost. His men were exhausted, and the war was far from over. The capture of Tobruk did not mean the end of the battle for North Africa. It merely set the stage for the next conflict. Rommel, having proven that even when surrounded by adversity, he could still find a way to win, now prepared for the next phase of his campaign. But the Allies were not defeated, yet they were already planning their response. The stage was set for the next great clash in the desert, one that would push Rommel and his forces to their limits. With the capture of Tobruk, Rommel's forces had secured a significant victory, but the war was far from won. The tide of battle in North Africa was about to change once again, and this time the stakes were higher than ever. As the Axis forces continued their push across North Africa, the Allies were regrouping, ready to strike back. In early 1943, the stage was set for one final, decisive showdown. The Battle of Tunisian all-out struggle for control of the region would become Rommel's final stand in North Africa. By now, Rommel was facing a dire situation. The long supply lines stretching from Europe to North Africa had become a significant burden. His forces were facing shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food. The relentless desert heat, combined with Allied air superiority, made every movement a challenge. Yet, Rommel refused to concede. Rommel's Africa Corps had been pushed to the brink, but his tactical brilliance and ability to inspire his men had kept them fighting. However, even the Desert Fox knew that the days of rapid, overwhelming victories were behind him. The Allies were no longer caught off guard. They had learned from their past mistakes and were now bringing their full might to bear. The Battle of Tunisia was a brutal, all-encompassing fight. The Germans and Italians found themselves entrenched in a war of attrition, trying to hold on to positions as the Allies advanced on all fronts. Rommel's forces faced fierce resistance from the combined might of the British, American, and Free French forces. The Allies had launched Operation Torch in November 1942, landing on the coast of North Africa, and were steadily pushing eastward. But Rommel wasn't done yet. Even in the face of mounting pressure, he remained a force to be reckoned with. His ability to outthink his opponents and adapt to the changing battlefield remained his greatest asset. Time and time again, he used his limited resources to deliver surprising counterattacks, keeping the Allies on edge. As the battle raged on, Rommel found himself in a precarious position. The Axis forces were surrounded, and the Allies' advantage in numbers, supply, and air power was undeniable. Rommel knew that the situation was becoming untenable. Yet, his commitment to his men, his desire to protect his soldiers, and his sense of duty kept him going. In March 1943, Rommel was reluctantly recalled to Germany by Hitler, who feared that his most famous general would be captured by the advancing Allied forces. It was a painful decision for Rommel, who had led his men through some of the most challenging battles in the desert. But his retreat signaled the beginning of the end for the Axis powers in North Africa. Rommel's withdrawal from the front lines marked the end of an era. His Africa Corps, once feared for its lightning-fast attacks and bold strategies, was defeated. The Allies had gained the upper hand in North Africa, and the Axis powers were on the retreat. Rommel, despite his brilliance, could not turn the tide alone. Though Rommel left North Africa in disgrace, his legacy was already cemented. His ability to fight against overwhelming odds, his tactical genius, and his unwavering resolve had earned him the admiration of both allies and enemies alike. But as he returned to Germany, he knew that the war was far from over, and for him a new, more dangerous chapter was just beginning. After his retreat from North Africa, Rommel returned to Germany, not as the victorious general he once was, but as a man whose reputation had been shaken. Despite his brilliant successes in the desert, the harsh reality of failure weighed heavily on him. Rommel had lost the battle for North Africa, and his career seemed uncertain. But what would come next for the Desert Fox would be both a test of his loyalty and his ability to navigate the treacherous politics of war. Back in Germany, Rommel was received with mixed emotions. His fame as a battlefield genius was still intact, but his failure in North Africa was a heavy stain on his record. Yet, despite the setback, Rommel remained a hero in the eyes of many. His tactics had been admired across the world, even by his enemies. There was a growing sense that Rommel might still play a pivotal role in Germany's future if he could find his place amidst the chaos of the Second World War. By 1943, Rommel was called upon again by Adolf Hitler not to lead the war in North Africa, but to defend Europe itself from the advancing Allies. Rommel was tasked with overseeing the defense of France, preparing for the inevitable Allied invasion that seemed increasingly likely as the war turned in favor of the Allies. Rommel was now facing his greatest challenge not against a foreign enemy, but against the harsh realities of war in Europe. As he arrived in France, Rommel found himself confronted with a different kind of warfare. The beaches of Normandy, the cliffs of the Atlantic Walrus, was no desert landscape. The defense of France would require new strategies, new thinking. And Rommel, ever the innovator, would be forced to adapt once more. Despite the overwhelming odds, Rommel began to pour his energy into defending the western coast of Europe. He was determined not to let the Allies gain a foothold. His efforts to strengthen the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall became legendary. Rommel's experience in North Africa, where he had used mobility and surprise to his advantage, now had to be applied in entirely different conditions. He was fighting against the clock, trying to prepare Europe for a battle that could very well decide the outcome of the war. But despite Rommel's best efforts, the situation continued to deteriorate. The Allies were making significant progress, especially with the successful day landings in June 1944. Rommel, who had initially been confident that the Allies could be stopped, now saw that victory was slipping away. The Battle of Normandy and the subsequent push into France was a devastating blow to Rommel's defensive strategy. The Allies had come prepared, and Rommel's forces were unable to halt their advance. Despite his extraordinary leadership, Rommel was forced to watch as the tide of the war shifted against him. But it wasn't just the war that was closing in on Rommel. Behind the scenes, a different kind of battle was unfolding. Rommel, who had long been admired by both the German public and the military, began to realize that his position in Hitler's regime was becoming increasingly precarious. Rommel, known for his tactical genius and his outspoken nature, had begun to grow disillusioned with Hitler's leadership. The final chapter in Rommel's story would not be written on the battlefield. As Germany's defeat became inevitable,
Rommel's fate took a tragic turn. A conspiracy was brewing within Germania group of officers who sought to overthrow Hitler and end the war. Rommel, unwilling to support a madman like Hitler, was secretly linked to the resistance. On the 14th of October 1944, Rommel was given an impossible choice. After being implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler, Rommel was forced to take his own life. Under intense pressure, and knowing the alternative was certain death for himself and his family, Rommel chose to end his life on his own terms. Rommel's death marked the end of an era. The Desert Fox, once hailed as a brilliant commander, was now a symbol of the tragic toll war takes on its heroes. His death sent shockwaves through Germany, and he was mourned by many who saw him as one of the last honorable men in the Nazi regime. But even in death, Rommel's legacy lived on. His tactics, his leadership, and his spirit would be studied by future generations of military leaders. His story, one of brilliance, resilience, and ultimately tragedy, would forever be remembered as a testament to the cost of war. Erwin Rommel's life ended tragically, but his legacy lives on, resonating far beyond the fields of battle. In the years following his death, Rommel became more than just a brilliant tactician. He became a symbol of both military excellence and moral complexity. Though he served in the Nazi regime, Rommel was never a blind follower. His actions on the battlefield often showed a respect for humanity that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Rommel was known for treating prisoners of war with dignity and for his honorable conduct, even in the chaos of the most brutal campaigns. His reputation was one of a soldier who, despite being entrenched in one of history's darkest conflicts, maintained a sense of honor. Rommel's brilliance was undeniable. His military tactics, bold, swift, and innovative, became the hallmark of his career. His leadership was studied and admired, not just in Germany, but across the world. The Desert Fox, as he came to be known, had an unmatched ability to inspire his men, to rally them in the face of adversity, and to consistently outthink and outmaneuver his opponents. His influence on military strategy remains significant to this day. However, Rommel's legacy is far from simple. His association with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime cast a shadow over his achievements. He was a man who, despite his moral compass, was entangled in a brutal and corrupt system. The question of whether Rommel was a hero or a man caught in the machinery of war has never had a simple answer. His story is one of brilliance and tragedy, of a soldier who did his duty, but who ultimately paid a heavy price for his association with a regime he could no longer support. In the end, Rommel's forced death by suicide after his involvement in the failed assassination attempt on Hitler revealed the immense internal conflict he faced. A man who had dedicated his life to his country only to be forced to take his own life to protect his family from Nazi retribution. His death symbolized the ultimate cost of war. Not just the lives lost on the battlefield, but the crushing toll it takes on the soul. Rommel's passing marked the end of an era where his exceptional military genius would never be matched again. Yet, his name remains, not just as a legendary general, but as a reminder of the complex and often tragic interplay between a soldier's duty and the moral choices they face. Rommel's legacy is one of both admiration and controversy. Was he a hero for his remarkable military achievements, or was he a tragic figure trapped in a war that demanded too much of him? Perhaps both. His legacy is a testament to the intricate nature of history, where even the brightest stars can be obscured by the darkness they were forced to navigate. As we remember Erwin Rommel, we are reminded of the true cost of war, not just the battles fought on the ground, but the battles fought within the hearts of those who lead them. So, what do you think of Rommel's legacy? Was he a hero, a villain, or something in between? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep the conversation going.